Salvete omnes, welcome to this week's video tutorial. I just posted your grades for those of you who have taken the first test on Blackboard. So please let me know if you can't see your grade. And also per email, the best way to get your test to you. We're going to move forward this week with chapter 24. As you can see, we have some advanced grammar once again, especially for English speakers, because we do not have ablative absolutes in English grammar. And as you know by now, English prefers active, not passive. And so this idea of the passive periphrastic is also not congenial in English. So it'll raise issues about how to translate it. And then, of course, since English is not a case-based language, the idea of a dative, which you're familiar with rather by now, also is something that we'll focus on. You definitely want to read through this chapter a couple of times and in particular study the examples before moving on to the exercises, just given the recondite nature of the vocabulary and the explanation of these concepts. As the text points out, the ablative absolute, as the term suggests, is absolved or separated from the main clause, and it will be in an ablative form. That being said, that doesn't perhaps help us too much to grasp it, and so by looking at examples, as is often the case when you're learning something, that's going to be the best way to understand a concept, namely practical examples versus the theory. So let's take a look at the first one here, and you'll see how it explicates the introductory note for the ablative absolute. So we have Rome visa vire gaudebant, and they give us a translation here. So how do we recognize the ablative absolute? Well, the first thing, of course, is we have to recognize the ablative endings. So let me pull up the noun declensions, which you either have to have memorized or certainly be able to pull up the chart, but really at this point you probably need to have the noun declensions memorized. So let me pull this up for just easy reference for us. So you can see the first example here, you can see that it ends in the first declension ablative singular with the letter A with the macron. So if we go back and take a look at the example, you can see Rome vise both end in first declension ablative singular. So, but then we have a comma, and you really have to have a sense that's based on the sense of the sentence that this is somehow absolved or loosened from the main clause, which again will take a little bit of getting used to. But almost invariably, an ablative absolute, as you'll see, is 2 or 3 words, and it's in the first part of a sentence. So, as is often the case, in theory, this is much more complex than it is in practice. Once you do several examples, you'll see that it's not as difficult as it looks, especially if we just get a grasp that we need the ablative here, that you'll see that it makes this concept much easier to identify and translate. Now, as we said before about participles, that when you have a participle ending, and here it is, the vise, because this is a verb, but it has a noun or adjective declension ending. So as we talked about in the previous chapter, that makes it a participle. So if you still are having issues understanding what a participle is, you definitely want to do some more research and go back to look at the previous chapter and do some online research. Don't forget, I think I did mention there is a textbook called, English Grammar for Students of Latin, I believe is the name of that series. And so that might also be a good reference book to get a handle on these concepts. But going back to this example, when we see the participle in the past tense, or excuse me, with a first or second declension ending, we have to translate it in the past tense. So that they give us the translation here, Rome having been seen. And we say having been seen, namely using the present perfect passive because of this first declension participle ending. As you'll see, I noticed that Rome also has the same ablative ending. So that helps. You have both the noun or object and the participle in the ablative case, and that fits the description of the ablative absolute. As you'll see a little bit later, that it is often helpful, although in one sense, requires a little bit more advanced understanding of Latin to do so, to put it in a more natural translation, but still keeping it in the past tense. So as you'll see a little bit later, the book recommends possible translations such as, after the men had seen Rome, they were rejoicing. But then, of course, that requires coming up with the correct conjunction, in this case, after, and still requiring some sense of what's going on in the original Latin to get to that point of a more idiomatic translation. So read this description too. Again, probably read it a couple of times. Let's go on to the next example here. Now here, as we said, when we have a participle, we need to recognize that this indeed is the participle. How do we know it's a participle? Because it's the fourth principal part, but it has in this case, a third declension nominative plural ending. So there's our is right there. So when we have a participle that is third declension, we said last chapter in the video tutorial that we're going to translate it as, go back to our text here, we're going to translate it in the present tense. So you can see the translation here, seeing Rome, Romam viventes vire gaudibant. So our ablative absolute is Romam videntis, and then our main clause is vire gaudibant. Because this is present tense, another possible, in fact, they give us this right here. No, you could see when the men see Rome, they, or in this case, we have to say, I guess, when after the men had saw Rome, they were rejoicing. Once again, I think it's easier just to keep it more literal in terms of the translation, because once we start making decisions in our translation, in my experience, if I'm being completely honest, more students are going to make more mistakes as they go from different words to tenses. But like anything else, you have to kind of decide your own method here. So let's move on to, okay, so the book is really good with giving us lots of different examples. So notice that this one also, so audio, audire, and then, so this is our participle. But notice that it has an ablative second declension ablative plural ending. So does the demonstrative pronoun. So here's our ablative absolute, his rebos audetis. So again, just looking at our chart here, you can see that it's in the ablative second declension is. So because we have an ablative participle ending, but the noun that is included in the statement is also in the ablative, that is what makes it an ablative absolute. So again, this is just part of Latin, that Latin uses grammatical concepts that we don't use in English. So we have to just be aware of that. But because the participle is a second declension ablative ending, we translate it or read it using the past tense in the passive. So you can see our translation here is these things, rebos referring to things, these things having been heard, he began to be afraid. But here, as I noted earlier, the book says this is probably what we would say in English, but then again, you have to determine which conjunction to use based on the context and then go from there. Here's a good example of what we're talking about here, is that this ablative absolute, now how do we know it's ablative absolute? Because this is second declension ablative singular O. This is third declension ablative singular E. So again, if you look at your declension chart, which I'm not going to pull up, you'll see that those are indeed the case endings, but you can see all the different ways to translate it. Quite frankly, since it's present tense, I would just say with him holding the power, I fear the outcome. But as you can see, you can also say since he holds power, when he holds power, if he holds power, although he holds power. The key, of course, here is because it is a third declension ablative ending, we need to use the present tense. So again, just to stress again, when you have participles, and again, this was pointed out in the previous chapter, when you have participles that are third declension in their ending, whether as a regular participle, in this case as a participle construction, namely an ablative absolute, we need to use the present tense. So notice all of these examples in English use the present tense. If we have a participle or a participle construction such as an ablative absolute in a first or second declension, then we translate it in the past tense. So just learning that distinction is going to take you a long way towards success for both ablative absolute and the broader notion of participles, which Latin is very fond of. So here's some other good examples that you should read. Again, I would definitely read the chapter a couple times as noted, and then study the examples. And of course, don't forget latintutorial.com. If you just go to that website and type in ablative absolute, he does a really good job of giving different examples and explaining it in a very clear way, where you can stop the video to make sure that you understand what's going on. Well, moving on to the passive periphrastic. The passive periphrastic is a passive verb form consisting of the gerendive, a common term for the future passive participle, with a form of sum, and I'm going to stop right here. Basically, what this is that something is to be done or ought to be done. And you'll see that we can recognize the gerendive because it has the gerund, just like as the word gerendive is spelled, and the book points this out too, by the way. See how we have the nd here? Well, when you have a future participle, because that's what it is, that's what we're talking about, something that needs to be done in the future. So it's a future passive participle is the passive gerendive. That we have the nd, but we still have a participle. How do we know that? Because we have a verb with a participle ending. In this case, laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. That is those are the four principal parts, rather, of the verb praise. Well, we don't have a regular verb tense ending. We have a participle ending in the first declension. So first declension is A. And so, but then we have this nd, we put it all together, we have this gerendive or future passive participle. So if you look at some of these examples right here, here's a good one. So haec femina laudanda est. So this woman is to be praised. The key for participles, as we taught in the passive more generally, as we noted in the previous chapter, and again, this just takes some practice getting used to, is not to separate the verb is, s in this case, from its participle complement, namely laudanda. If you separate the two, you're going to run into translation issues. And so the key is to kind of recognize it as a pair. But of course, that's the big challenge, is how do you recognize it as a pair? Well, like anything else, you just keep practicing, and just given human reason and human nature, you will eventually get it. Here's another example. Id faciendum est. So again, we know that this is a future passive participle. So it means not simply this is about to be done, but rather this has to be done, or this should be done. And then here we have it kind of in the past tense. This had to be done. You'll see that in practice for the examples that would possibly be on the next test, that this entire chapter, just to kind of look forward a little bit here, you're going to see that this chapter only has 9 sententia antiqui, and then the main passage is very short. So I think the authors of this book recognize that this is going to throw American students for a curveball, just given the rather unusual grammatical terminology. So if you think about it, this is all that you're going to have to learn and be responsible for the next test, which is not a whole lot of language. So just sort of keep that in mind, that although the concepts are rather abstract or theoretical or unfamiliar, in practice, the number of exercises that we're doing are very few in number compared to what they could be or other chapters. Okay, so as always, take a look at the vocab. This is the vocab that will be used in this chapter. Don't forget the companion website. Wheelox has audio files to learn how to pronounce them. I would recommend pronouncing them. And don't forget, on the next test, you will have 10 words of vocabulary matching from the chapters that we're doing. Okay, let's take a look at the examples. So we have the Sententia Antiquae. So we have Carthago delenda est. Now, of course, this is a reference to Hannibal and the Punic Wars of the 2nd century BC. And here is Cato, famous Roman politician, saying that Carthage is to be destroyed. So here's our guarantive here. This could also be translated as Carthage ought to be destroyed. Notice where if we don't recognize this as the guarantive, then we might, in other words, if we separate delenda and est, someone might translate this as Carthage is destroyed. That wouldn't be correct, because one, we'd be separating the two, and then two, we'd be putting it in the present tense. Whereas, believe it or not, just to go back to what we're talking about here, even though it might not come out in the translation, this is a future passive participle. So you'd actually be putting the wrong form of the verb, which is a major deduction anytime we make a mistake with the subject and verb in a language. But putting it all together, Carthage is to be destroyed, ought to be destroyed, should be destroyed, must be destroyed. So that must be, the be is what gives its passive qualities. But ultimately, as you know, Latin basically is memorizing, as is any of the case. But certainly, as I mentioned to some of you, meeting you in person, unlike a modern language where you can develop oral spontaneity in speaking, because it's a classical language and you can't live in the target culture, developing a spontaneous capacity for oral speech is very, very, very unlikely. And because it is largely a written language, probably needs to be memorized. All right, so number 2. So you can see that this is our ablative absolute. How do we know it? Well, we know it because it has 2 words. So an ablative absolute almost always will have 2 or 3 words. It'll be at the beginning of a sentence. And the words in question both end in the first declension ablative singular. So we have 2 words with the ablative, and then we have the comma sort of absolving or separating it from the main clause. We put it all together, then we should be able to we need to be able to recognize it rather as a ablative absolute. Now, because the participle is in the first declension, as we said, we need to translate this using the past tense. So there's a couple of ways to do this. Literally, with Asia having been destroyed, or I guess conquered in this case, yeah. With Asia having been conquered, or after Asia had been conquered. So notice both of those examples put the participle construction, in this case the ablative absolute, in the past tense. So let's go with that one. So after Asia had been conquered, and then we just continue with our regular reading of Latin. The happy Roman leader, so the happy Felix Roman leader, as you know, Latin likes to put adjectives after the noun. The happy Roman leader sent many slaves to Italy, or into Italy. So it's based on Pliny the Elder. So as you can see, the main clause is pretty straightforward. So this is mito, mitere, misi, misum. So we need to be able to recognize this as the third principal part of mito, M-I-T-T-O, which is past tense. So the happy Roman leader sent many servants. So there's our multo servos. That is our second declension accusative plural. That's our direct object. And so who's sending whom? Well, he's sending servants. And so you can see this one's fairly straightforward. The key in this one is there's the ablative absolute recognizing to translate this in the past because it's a first declension ending. The next one is a little bit trickier. So we need the first word is this is Caesar here. So omnibus ferro militis per territis quisque ser sevare cupiebant. What do we have here? Well, we're gonna have to look up the words here. Now, omnibus, omne, omnis, omnibus, it's a common adjective word in Latin, but you can see it is in the third declension. So third declension ablative plural is ibus. So we keep that ending in mind, and that's important for a number of reasons. Foremost among them is this tells us because it's third declension, we have to translate this in the present tense. So, and then here is kind of our participle here. So this one's a little bit longer, ablative absolute, but we're going to come up with something to the extent that with everyone terrified by the soldier's sword. So with everyone terrified by the sword of the soldier. Notice how that sounds a little bit stilted. So you might say because everyone was afraid of the soldier's sword, or everyone being afraid of the soldier's sword. Either way, we need to choose a present tense translation. So let's go with the first one here because it's more literal, a little bit easier perhaps. So with everyone being terrified by the sword of the soldier. So notice of the soldiers, third declension, genitive singular, is. And then quisque means everyone or each person. Each person was wanting to save himself. So each person was wanting. So there's our imperfect. To save, there's our infinitive, and then himself. The reflexive pronoun se always refers back to the subject in the sentence, in this case, each person. Here we have a gerendive again. How do we know that? Because we have the nd in there. So we have a verb, we have a verbal participle, but it looks a little bit longer. So we're going to have to translate this as the future. So whatever is, so it has a future meaning, certainly. So whatever is to be said, or whatever is to be said, I shall say, I shall speak freely. So whatever is to be said, I shall, or I will speak freely. Again, that's the translation I would go with. I guess it does sound a little bit stilted, but remember, this is a language that is over 2,000 years old, so in one sense, it shouldn't be that easy to translate, strictly speaking, if you think about it. But another possibility would simply be is if something needs to be said, I shall say so freely. The idea here is that he's going to speak his conscience. Moving on to number 5 here. Haec omnia vulnerabili tibi nunc senande sunt. So here we have another gerendive because we have the nd here. So we have haec means these. So all these wounds, like if somebody's vulnerable, so all these wounds of war ought to be healed now by you. So here he's probably, remember, he's referencing the civil wars in the 60s, 50s, and 40s and 30s in Rome. Well, not the 30s, because remember, he was killed before then. But all these wounds of war. This one's fairly straightforward. And then ought to be healed. Remember, if it's in italics, that's our translation. And then now, by you. You can move around the word order, especially now. You can imagine putting that in a different spot. So as you can see, these examples, once you know the vocab, and remember, you can use a dictionary on the test, are not that difficult. But the concept itself on the surface seems more difficult. Number 6. Nec tumultum, nec hastam militis, nec mortum violentam timebo, Augusto terres tenente. So right away, we at the end here, we have our, I said that normally, or often the case, the ablative absolutes in the beginning. Here it's at the end. How do we know? Because we have tenio, tendere, tenui, tenentum. We have this, those are principal parts of hold, but notice that we have third declension ablative singular ending, namely E. So again, you can see there's our third declension ablative singular E, which means that we need to translate this ablative absolute in the present tense. So maybe we'll start with this, and you could change the word order. So with Augustus holding literally the lands, I guess, or the territories, with Augustus, Caesar Augustus, with Augustus holding the territories, and then we need to go back to I will fear, or I shall fear. So there's our future bo be be boo. I will fear neither tumult nor the spear of a soldier, nor a violent death. So by tumult, I guess he means further military hostilities. No, they give us, okay, all I have to do is look. Okay. So here it is. Tumultus means disturbance or civil war, but it is where we get the word tumult. So let's go with civil war. So with Augustus holding the territories, I will fear, or I shall fear, probably I shall fear sounds a little bit better. I shall fear neither civil war, nor the spear of a soldier, or nor a soldier's spear, apostrophe S, nor a violent death. So notice tumultum, hastam, mortem are all in the accusative. This is second declension accusative singular, first declension accusative singular, and third declension accusative singular. How do we know? Because of our tumultum, hastam, and mortem. All right, moving on to septem. Here is reference to certainly a less desirable person in Roman politics. So here, ablative absolute. How do we know it? Because we have this verb with a ablative ending, second declension ablative singular is us, e, o, o. So here it just kind of makes sense maybe to use after. So after Tarquinius had been expelled, or I guess you could say after Tarquinius was expelled, and was thrown out of his rule. So after Tarquinius had been expelled, the name of, let's see, so let's go. So the Roman people was not able to hear the name of the king. So he was one of the original kings in the 8th century, I believe. And of course, that ended in 753. It's generally considered the beginning of the Roman Republic, which lasted until 31 BC. So after Tarquinius had been expelled, the Roman people was not able to hear the name of the king or the king's name. Notice kings is third declension genitive singular. So king's name referring back to Tarquinius. Don't forget when we translate names in Latin, we got to put it in the nominative. So Tarquinius, US, because we have to put it back in the nominative subject case. Octo, number 8. Let's see what we got here. So ad utilitatem vitae omnia concilia factaque nobis regenda sunt. So what do we got here? So let's see, this one's a little bit trickier with word orders. It looks like, okay, so we have like literally to utility of life, all decisions and deeds to us are to be carried out. So this one's a little bit trickier to translate. So I guess what we have here is that all deeds, or excuse me, all decisions and deeds ought to be carried out by us for the sake of further usefulness of life, or for their life advantage. So for their life advantage. Now notice in English, because remember these are passive constructions. See, but I'm kind of bumbling with the translation here. Probably in English it would be better to just make it active. Is that we? So in English we put it in the active. We ought to make all of our decisions and deeds for the sake of life advantage. Even that doesn't sound all that great. Let's give it one more shot here. So all deeds, or excuse me, all plans and deeds ought to be carried out by us for their usefulness in life. There we go. I'm going to go with usefulness in life. Sounds a little bit better. But ought to be carried out. Notice that the gerundive is in the plural because the noun is concilia factaque. So deeds, or excuse me, deeds and plans. All right, number 9 here. So cessare omnia uno tempora errant agenda. So literally, so once again, we have another gerundive here. So what's going on here is that for Caesar, all of these things were carried out at the same time. This is a reference to Caesar's De Bello Gallico. I don't know how much you know about it, but he talks about himself in the third person. The text is partly military strategy and also political propaganda, as it's often read. But the idea is that Caesar is very swift, Caesar is very decisive, and that what Caesar says is done immediately. And so that's the sense of this, is that for Caesar, so remember Caesar is third declension, so third declension dative singular is I, so for Caesar, everything, all the things had been carried out literally at the same time, which again still sounds a little bit stilted, but that's what we're going to go with. All right, so take a look at these examples, or rather review these examples rather, and then on Wednesday, if you have questions, certainly let me know. All right, let's take a look at, we're just going to take a look at this brief text right here, and we're not going to do this text over here. This is by Horace. I like Horace. He was born in 65 BC and died in 8 AD. Very, very important Latin writer. And here it says, Horace turned to writing verse epistles, epistulae, as well as lyric poetry after publishing his 2 volumes of satire. And again, you can read the rest of this. One of the things that you'll see in his writings is that, although it'd be somewhat misleading to say that he focuses on the common man, because remember, he also was under the patronage of Caesar Augustus. It is true that a lot of his language does focus on everyday Roman life and simple moral virtues that are important for prosperity, if not in the ancient world, also today. So let's take a look at what we got here. So this is called De Cupiditate, which means on desire or on greed. On lust might be somewhat of a forced translation. It sounds too biological for Horace's language, but on cupidity, Qupidity would actually be a better translation. But again, that sounds somewhat old-fashioned in the 21st century. On human desire, actually, for me, sounds maybe like the best translation. Or, since this is a Latin class, let's just keep it in the original. Let us read. Homo stultus, o civis inquit pecunia ante omnia quae renda est, virtus et probitas post pecuniam. Pecuniae autem cupidatas, fugindia est, fugiendia etiam est cupidatas gloriae, erripit enum libertatem, neque imperia semper petenda sunt, neque semper excipienda, etiam deponenda non numquam. So you can see we have a lot of gerundives here. We have one right here, and we have one right here, and one right here, and we have one right here, and one right there, and one right there. So let's go through this here. Homo stultus, which means a stupid man. So if somebody's stupid or stultified, it means they're slow-witted. So a stupid man says, "O citizens, money is to be sought before all else. Virtue and truth after money." That's pretty straightforward. So a stupid man says, inquit, "O citizens, money ought to be sought." I think I said place, but it's like a question. Ought to be sought, or should be sought, or is to be looked for before everything else. Virtue and truth after money. In other words, obviously, virtue and truth are to be sought after money. But cupidatas, now here is actually our subject. Means like desire. So, but the desire for money, let's see, what's the best way to translate this one here? Is to be avoided, I guess. Let's see, fugienda, no, it means like to flee. Let's see, let me look this up here. I don't like that translation. So I'm going to go to Whitaker's Words. And so, so it is where we get the word fugitive, but that doesn't sound, so flee, fly, run away, avoided, or shunned. Oh, so there we go. Avoid. Let's go with avoided. So avoid is going to be the best translation. But longing for money is to be avoided. But longing for money, notice for money, that's going to be, since pecunia is first declension, there's our first declension dative singular. So remember, dative is to or for whom something is done, in this case for money. But longing for money is to be avoided. Longing for glory is also to be avoided. Now that may be a little counterintuitive. What do you think I think he's maybe referencing just political power. So longing for glory is also to be avoided. For it will take away liberty. Neither, let's see, okay, neither power always are to be sought. Okay. For neither is power also to be sought and always accepted. It should never, even though it will never be vanquished. So let's come up with that last part there. So, for it takes away liberty. Neither, let's see, what's the verb here? I guess neither imperia semper. Yeah, this neque kind of makes it a little bit awkward, but the idea here is that nor is power always only to be sought or always to be accepted. Also, although it will never be completely vanquished, or in this case, never be completely put down. So this last part is a little bit tricky to translate, just because it seems to be missing some words. Let me try it one more time here. Let's see. I got to read the whole thing here to get a sense of the flow. So, but longing for money is to be avoided. Longing for glory is also to be avoided. Neither is power always to be sought or always to be accepted. There we go. That's a little bit better. It also, even though, this is where we have to say, even though it will never be completely put down. So the idea here seems to be, of course, that even though power and glory and money are unavoidable, or seemingly unavoidable in human life, and we're never going to be able to put them down completely, that we should keep in mind that liberty and other virtues have a moral quality that are irreplaceable. All right, well, that is it for today's lesson. Take a look at this, and then on Wednesday, if you have particular questions about this chapter and the exercises that we have covered and that you'll be responsible for the next test, let me know. I think since next week is fall break, I think it only affects one of our days, but I think we'll go ahead and just take a pause that entire week. That'll give everybody a chance to consolidate their understanding of Latin thus far, and in particular the passive participles that we've been dealing with in the last couple of chapters. And then we'll continue with chapter 25 the following week, and that will put us in a position to have the second of the third tests at that time as well. Thank you.